Right, well, whilst everyone's joining, I'll just do a little introduction. So hi, everyone. I'm Adele, and I'm Head of Community here at esynergy. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this edition of the Tech Series. This is our regular event series that we run for our technical and wider communities. I know that many of you that are joining today have been part of our community for a while, but for those that are new, esynergy, we are a technology consultancy delivering value that is measurable and tied back to our clients' business objectives. And we deliver our engagements by drawing on our expert ecosystem, which is a combination of senior associates and delivery partners that bring vertical expertise. We're really delighted to be running the session today, which is all around open source in the enterprise. So before we begin, if you have any questions at all, then please pop them over via the chat box and Eddie will answer them, hopefully if we can throughout, but also we'll make some time, plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the talk. We are going to be recording the session, so if you do want to rewatch anything from today, this will be shared after by email. So without further ado, I'm going to give a warm welcome to Eddie. Over to you.
So thank you so much, Adele, for that amazing intro. Everyone, welcome. I'm super excited for today. I'm really looking forward to your questions. The questions are my favorite part, so do ask as you go along. We'll try, as Adele said, try and incorporate them as we go, but if not, we will have time at the end. And I love it to see people sharing where they're from. So hi, Hubert from Poland. So open source in enterprise. So while I'm kind of just doing my intro, everyone, let me know not only where you're from, so great question from Adele, but also what your exposure is to open source. Do you contribute to open source? Do you use open source? Just give us a bit of background so therefore we can tailor this for all of you. So let's get started. So I just want to quickly say what we're going to cover today. So we're going to look at the relationship between open source and companies in 2021. And I'm going to share some of my experiences with corporate, private sector clients, high street banks, and their journey to open source and their challenges and kind of some successes in there as well. So you're going to see how it changes over time. I'm going to talk about, why you shouldn't fear open source, and it doesn't make you less secure. Actually, it makes you more secure. So I'll be really interested to see where people see their challenges with their companies or their clients as well around this. I will also highlight why open sourcing your projects makes you more desirable as an employer. I think that's really important. I do see more and more people in the community looking to go to work for companies that not only use open source, but also contribute to open source and have open source projects themselves. I mean, even big companies like AWS, Netflix, Amazon, they all have open source projects as well, which I think is great. It's a great way to retain talent as well. And I'm going to touch upon some technical tools. Again, my favorite part of today's talk is, in addition to the questions, is going to be talking about things like CoPilot, code spaces, GitHub Actions, and the future of open source and enterprise. No matter where you are in your open source journey, personally or as a company, I think we're going to have lots of tips here for you to get started, and you're going to see how easy it is to automate a lot of best practices in your projects, which is going to set you apart from everyone else. Okay, the chat's a bit quiet, so hopefully you all haven't fallen asleep yet. Do just say hello in the chat. And Chris says, my screen is black. Okay, I don't know if anyone else has the same issue, but hopefully Adele can let me know if more people have the same issue in the chat as well. If it was black for everybody, Adele and Peter would have shouted at me by now, so I think we're doing okay. Chris, you might want to just rejoin. It might work. Okay, so a bit about me. So why can I talk about open source? Well, I'm GitHub Star, and I was GitHub Star of the Year. So that means I was selected 1 out of 65 million people on GitHub. This is why I'm super passionate about getting everyone and companies into open source. I'm a founder of the inclusive open source community EdiHub, where we actually say collaboration first, code second. So I want to make something really clear. When I talk about open source, I don't just mean code. I see people open sourcing books, recipes, legal documents, and it's a lot around collaborations, project management issues, and we're going to get all into that. I also have a YouTube channel, almost 30,000 subscribers. I have a Twitter account that's growing very fast. I keep updating this like every day, the last few days. I think I'm almost approaching 40,000 followers on Twitter now. So do come and say hi, and let's geek out in tech Twitter. Okay, enough about me. Let's get started. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to just briefly talk about what is open source, and let me know in the chat if you know what open source is, and if someone says open source to you, what does it mean to you? So I'm going to give you a quick second to write that before I give my answer. So my answer is, I believe open source is like Instagram. People can like, they can comment, they can reshare, but they can also make changes and improvements. So GitHub is a social coding platform, but it's on steroids. I really believe it has that extra dimension that other social platforms don't have. Okay, yes, the naming might be slightly different. Rather than kind of like, you've got Star, but you get the idea. Yes, there are other platforms besides GitHub. I thought I'd better put that in there before other people jump in and say, what about Bitbucket, GitLab, and so forth? There are other ones, but GitHub is the most popular one. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But if you have any questions around the others, do let me know. I'll try and answer them. So yes, just to repeat, everyone, if you can in the chat write kind of where you are in your open source kind of journey, I'll be interested to know. That would really, really help. Okay, let's move on. So where are we in 2021? I know it's 2022, but I've got some stats on 2021. That's why I'm going to mention that. So actually, in a recent survey, IT executives and decision makers, information was collected from them by VMware Tanzu on the state of open source in 2021. 95% of people who took the survey said they use open source software in production. And for some companies, open source software is the only alternative. This could be for a variety of reasons. Either there's no proprietary software available to achieve what they need for their project, or as you'll see in some of the case studies, companies don't want to go through the lengthy procurement process, which causes delays to the project. Okay, let me wait for this slide to load. Just really, these animations are quite slow. So, so the top benefits of open source, I think. Let me actually skip this one. Let's move on. So, in the same survey, I want to talk about the stakeholders that saw the top benefits of open source in production. They said that 79% of them said it reduced costs. I mean, open source is free, so almost free. In some cases it isn't, but that's a whole other conversation. If anyone knows about the whole Elasticsearch and Amazon, that's you know what I mean. But also 63% said it's more flexible. It's true, right? You can see the code, you can do what you want with it, you can fork it and if you need to, and make other changes. If I use any terms, by the way, like forking and so forth, and people don't know what that means, please do write in the chat and I will try and have a look and explain those things. And also 58% said there's a benefit from a huge community and the knowledge that it brings. And I think that's really, really important. It's so important to have that community support and knowledge. Also, developer productivity, 45%. I'm going to dig into this one later on, but I think this one is quite interesting. Not only productivity, but also best practices and quality. I think if it's open source, the level is really high, and I want to explain why shortly. So I want to go into my first case study, which is, I've seen loads of case studies through my career of over 15 years. So I had to pick a few that I think highlighted different areas. I think that was important to give you kind of a broad example. So I was able to guide them. I'm not going to mention any names here. So I was able to guide them through open source efficiently and safely through all of them. So they do have some commonality, but they do have a lot of differences. So let's have a look. Let's jump straight in. Right. So the first case study refers to a government department. And on the left-hand side, you have the challenges that were presented. On the right-hand side, we had the successes, all the benefits. Okay, I can definitely see it's weighted toward the challenges, but no one leave, do bear with us. It does start weighting the other way as we kind of go through this journey. I promise you, it does get better. But let's talk about some of the challenges. Notifications. For those of you who are active on GitHub, Twitter, Discord, Slack, wherever it is, you'll know that notifications can get quite busy and quite distracting. But when your open source project gets traction, you are going to see more notifications, but I believe it's a good problem to have, and we're going to get into that later on. But in this place, the product owner was worried that notifications from the open source contributions would create a distraction to the team. Like I said, I see this as a massively positive and not negative, and because the notifications represent engagement and people getting involved in the project, adding value. Even asking questions really adds value. I think that's really, really important. So another challenge we had was a separate workflow. So part of open sourcing a project means that your workflow is public, and the community effectively becomes your wider team. And there are just like so many benefits to this. Okay, so Dan talks about license risk. I do have a section on a very brief section on licensing later on. So I'll hold that for now. I'll come back to it, and if not, we can talk more at the end. And security flaws of open source. Again, I'm going to get to that shortly, Gary. So again, hopefully it answers it. If not, please repeat the question later on, and we'll see. So the workflow could include issue templates, pull request templates, and GitHub Actions or CI or CD, whatever kind of you're using. You could be using Circle CI or Travis CI. I'm going to talk a lot about GitHub Actions here. So it wouldn't contain any of the data from the database or any sensitive information. But however, the project owner was insistent on having two workflows, an internal workflow and an external workflow. And this wasn't because of security concerns, but because they wanted the team to prioritize the internal items first over the external items. So if there were any suggestions, ideas, bug fixes, feature requests, they wanted that to be a low priority if it came from externally and high priority from internally. I can kind of see their thinking. Obviously, someone passionate about open source and being transparent, it doesn't work. So you saw anything from the community as a kind of a good to have, and we'll get onto that when we got round to it. But you guessed it, it never got done. If it's not as part of your main workflow, then it's not going to get done, right? It's always next time, later, tomorrow, next sprint. And this created a separation between us and them, so the core team and the community, and this soon became apparent to the community. And naturally, this led to the community losing interest in the project and actually gave that government department a bad reputation in the open source world, which of course, impacted their credibility, engagement for future open source projects, hiring new candidates. The client, they were using open source tools, which means they were benefiting from the open source community, but they weren't contributing back, and they weren't, kind of bridge that gap and trying to get involved. I really felt that the external workflow was just a checkbox exercise, which actually gave us no benefit, and gave us more work and kind of guaranteed a bad reputation. So that is a big kind of sound effect, big no, don't do that. But it's great that you all can learn from what they've done and what didn't work. So automation, again, I think automation is super important. I got a section on this later on, a big technical section. I'll show you some code. But automation is great for repeatable tasks. Anything that is just repeatable, we should automate it. It allows the team to focus on more valuable collaboration and contributions to each other's work. I just see so many projects where people are saying spacing's wrong, formatting's wrong, you're using the wrong type of quotes for the string. We have tools for that. We shouldn't be discussing those. We should be discussing the more valuable information. So still definitely have the discussions, but not to get distracted with repetitive stuff. As I mentioned, I'll dive into this later on with certain tools that we can use that can check those, create releases, and do deployments and change logs. But this team and other teams, without having these tools automated, the team can't scale. As you get more contributions or the team grows, you get more noise and a lot more work. So I think for open source projects, and if you're expecting open source contributions, you really need to automate all the repeatable tasks. I need to set them up from the beginning, one of the first things that I do in all my open source projects. And in fact, when we did have some automated tasks, like automated testing, when the tools reported that there was an issue, it was seen as a hindrance rather than a help. So a lot of the time, towards the end of the sprint, they were disabled, which I felt it was like taking one step forward and like kind of 10 steps backward. So it really compounded the problem. I felt it was a false economy. Right, now to the advantages of this slide. Yes, there's only one. It's going to be short, and it's not as impactful as it could be. Again, we'll see later why. So hiring and retaining talent is really, really important. So when you're growing the team, if you've got an open source project, you'll typically look at the top contributors to your project. As these people know your project, they know your workflow, and they can hit the ground running from day one. But however, as I mentioned, this project didn't have a true open source project. So therefore, it was just a facade, and we couldn't check that. So instead, we actually looked at the open source tools we were using, and we reached out to people who are the top contributors on those open source tools. And actually, we're able to secure an expert in one of the tools the open source tools we were using. And on their day one, yes, they had to get familiar with our project, but they also brought our attention to other open source tools that we're unaware of that actually solved so many technical challenges we had, and also saved us a lot of time. So I think that straight away added just so much value. So the next case study was for a global company that had contracts with government departments around the world, not just in the UK. But one of the interesting things here is you can see on the challenges on the left, we have licensing, as brought up in one of the questions a moment ago. Open source projects need to have a license attached to it, and not having a license does not mean it's more open or does not mean it's more closed. It actually means you default to GitHub's T's and C's. So I think it's really important to have a license, and there are loads of licenses available, ones with different permissions and what you can do with it, but it's outside the scope of this talk today. We'll definitely run out of time. But I do have a YouTube video on this as well, so do go check that out if you want to see more about that. But this client had concerns around licensing. They wanted to ensure that the dependencies and the open source projects we used in this project before we open sourced it, conform to all the licensing. I think that's important, but this was very time consuming and impractical, especially as it was like an afterthought. So it could take an average of 1 month for them to review a license for a single dependency. And sometimes you end up with a lot of dependencies. So I think it's important to make this as part of your process and make it efficiently, because we were effectively halted until they did these checks. It is often forgotten that licenses aren't checked, but I think you definitely make it streamlined and fit into the project's timeline. So, okay. People on the project also weren't sure who had sign off, what was allowed and what wasn't. And the project had it was a big team. It had a lot of kind of people at the top, and no one knew who had the authority to open source the project, and actually didn't know who did. So as a result, it was a lot of unclear of what we could do. And I'll go into this later on as well. Right, okay. Let's go on to the positives, the successes, and let's see. Just looking at the chat, loving that more questions are coming in. This is great. I'm going to come back to those in a moment. Just want to finish the case studies first as well. So whilst the project itself was not open source, everyone was keen to improve the open source tools that we were using. And we had noticed that there were gaps in the automated tests or out-of-date documentation and bugs. And the team was allowed a small amount of time to improve these areas, to contribute back to the open source tools we were using. And the contributions had an immediate effect on improving not only the tools we were using, but it had a knock-on effect on our project, but also it increased the team's morale and participation. So from these contributions, a real collaborative culture evolved, where we had like brown bag lunches, we had meetups in the evening. It was really, really interesting. So like I said, the project itself wasn't open source, but they really embraced they were using open source tools. And to the second success, retaining talent. So no project is perfect, obviously, but with all this collaboration with the team, they were all keen to continue to work on this project and work together, because everyone was really supportive and they were still learning it at the same time. So we're able to retain a lot of talent as well. So the final case study is for a high street bank. So again, hopefully this gives you people different perspectives on this. Everyone's okay, no more questions, just checking. So this one I'm laughing because it's kind of the most recent one, and there's just so many areas to it. I'm trying to pick out the best ones. They were really concerned about the data. It just kept coming up over and over again. They were really concerned, if we open source our project, do people have access to our data? And it's like, no, you're open sourcing the code, not the data. And I have seen this come up a few times before with other clients, but this place, they were really, really focused on this, and they wouldn't let it go. They were like a dog with a bone. They wouldn't let it go. So That's why I'm kind of grinning, because no matter how many times we explained it and gave examples, they would always bring that up. So I like to give an analogy. So from what I learned was to give analogies. And the one I use on this is, by open sourcing your project, you're not giving the community the address and keys to your home. You're simply giving them access to a show home so they can make suggestions, all of which you'll need to approve anyway. They can't change anything in the project without your approval, but they can make suggestions and get involved in the conversation. So we're making the files public, not the deployment, not the production servers, and not the data. All that will remain secure. Everything private will remain private. And I did see some clients, I think just before we started, Adele asked me a question, which I'm going to actually bring in now, which is some people like to, I don't know if it's using the excuse, but they say we can't make our project open source because we've got our private keys, our tokens, our passwords in the code base in the project. And that's no reason to keep it private, because you shouldn't be doing that even if it's a private project. People clone the source code, it goes on that one computer, it goes on a laptop, it goes on a desktop, they might do it on their phone and so forth. So even if your project is private, people should not be putting anything private in the project. So that's really, really important. So they were also worried that, okay, if we're making the code public, what happens if someone sees an exploit in one of the dependencies we're using? Maybe now they can find a security flaw and they can exploit it. It can happen, but it's very rare. Most of the time, because people don't want to exploit these, they actually want to do things like bug bounty, which is where they can submit to the third-party library a bug bounty privately that they found a flaw, and they actually get paid to do it. That's why a lot of open source projects get funding to pay out the security improvement, because this is really, really important. So I've actually never seen any negatives out of this. I've only seen positives. So keeping up with the analogy of the show home though, if someone does identify like a flaw with a particular type of lock in your show home, you got to remember that the actual deployed version is in the house is in a secure state, surrounded by alarmed gates, and plus the person doesn't know where the house is, right? They only know where the show home is. I think that's really, really important. I do want to reiterate that people don't want to find loopholes to try and exploit it. Okay, authorization. So I'm just conscious of time, actually. I might skip this one because it is similar to the previous case study, so I might just skip over that. People weren't sure who had the authority to sign it off. So in this situation, everyone wanted it open sourced. It was actually really good. We got to the last hurdle, but no one would put it in writing to say, yes, make it open source, like hit that button. Everyone approved it verbally in meetings, but no one would actually write it, go public. So that was really upsetting. But on the positive, so down the right-hand side of this, you can see it's more balanced now. We had full automated testing, end-to-end testing, unit testing, linting, deployment. Everything was automated. We had pen testing. We had everything checked with the project, which was really useful. And the reason why I'm highlighting testing here is because we almost had 100% code coverage with our end-to-end test. And I know that's a questionable metric, but at least it is a metric nonetheless. We actually had minimal bugs. We're able to refactor from different APIs really easily with not introducing any bugs, and we were really ready to go open source. Even our documentation, which is mostly forgotten about, was up to date. We had technical documentation, we had user documentation, all as part of the work. So when someone made changes to the code base, they also updated the automated test, they also updated the documentation. We really went faster and faster. A lot of projects kind of go slower and slower over time. We really went faster and faster and really improved the efficiency of the project. Actually, it was sometimes so performant efficient, and we delivered early before our deadlines. People also asked in the sprint demos to the team, is this a real app or is it a mock-up? We got that regularly. It's quite a nice feeling. It's not often that happens, so it was quite good. And when we had the external pen test, we passed with flying colors because we already had a pen testing tool running on our GitHub Actions. I think I'm going to skip over this one now. Let's move on. Just common misconceptions. Your data is definitely private, and open source is more secure. More eyes on it, different points of view is really, really important. I know people think that having a gatekeeper is more secure, but it's not, because you only get one point of view, one set of eyes on it. So I think it's important to have different perspective. Having multiple people review the changes, people look at it from different points of view. If you've got kind of a front-end person, a back-end person looking at the changes, they're going to look at it from a different perspective, a tester, a designer, and so forth. So it really improves the important, and again, to reiterate, the data is not made public as well. So one thing I would definitely suggest to keep things secure, and this is where most projects fall down, is they don't keep their dependencies up to date. So they think, oh, we'll update it next sprint we'll update it. But the problem with that is, as you fall further behind, you don't get the bug fixes, the security fixes, the improvements, but also it becomes very hard to update the dependencies. And I have seen projects, again, I won't mention any names, where the dependencies were so far out of date, they actually couldn't do an upgrade without rewriting the entire project. So as they were putting that out, that was really, quite dangerous, and it was really expensive to fix. So I think that's important to keep your dependencies. It should be part of the sprint. Make sure you keep dependencies up to date as well. Okay, as I mentioned, open source is not just about a term, open source public, but it's also like a broad set of values, a bit like DevOps, right? It's not a job role, it's a culture, it's a mentality, it's working as a team together. And the more and more I see enterprises pitching themselves as open source employers, the more I see people wanting to go work for those. And there are a lot of benefits. They get to have all the best talent, and those people want to be exposed and work with other great talent as well. So I think that's really important. And having the project public and transparent, people do better work. Like if you're going to do something, if you're going to make notes for yourself, you might just scribble it down and what have you. But if you're going to make notes for someone else, straight away you make it better, and it probably takes like 5% longer. So it's having open source, the quality from all the team members improves straight away, because their future employers will see it, their future colleagues, their friends, and so forth. So straight away improves it. And people want to work with up-to-date technologies, with better projects. They don't want to work with legacy systems. So I think that's really, really important too. So also that the team morale, really, really improves as well. And it's great for them to collaborate with people outside their team, with the wider audience as well. They want to grow their personal brand at the same time, and they need to, make sure that what they're putting out there is really good. Also, it helps a faster onboarding. If you're hiring someone from the community who's familiar with your project, as I mentioned before, they can really hit the ground running. We've had people on day one already have the project on their computer because they were contributing to the project open source already. So literally day one just got started and we're picking up tickets and getting working. We're going to talk about some tools in a minute about how you can help improve onboarding and collaborating as well. So in the next slide, I'm going to look at the cutting edge technologies that we can use to also help our open source projects and make it a success. And I do have some predictions as well. So I want to talk briefly about cloud. More and more things are moving to the cloud. We had VMs, then we had containers, we have serverless, we have Kubernetes. Also, AI is becoming really popular with things like GitHub CoPilot, and tools becoming smarter. They can really help us with improved quality and remove blockers. We have tools like I mentioned, GitHub Actions, that can automate the trivial tasks, even complex tasks, even chaining them. I have concrete examples of this, so I can't wait to get your feedback on those as well. Okay, let's go straight onto this. So actually, let me skip over this one. I want to skip over this one as well. Let's go ahead. I'm just conscious of time. I'm trying to look at Adele's face to see if she's like shaking her head and say, Eddie, you're taking too long. When I talk about open source, we could all be here till tomorrow. So I need to make sure I don't go too far. And thanks everyone for asking the questions as well. I can't wait to get on with these. So this is a basic workflow. The reason why I bring this up is because this is what the areas I'm going to cover. And yes, there's a lot more to it than this. I'm not saying this is the full workflow, but I just want to briefly show kind of, you've got your IDE, if it's locally or in the cloud, then you either pair with somebody or you use an AI pair programming tool. You have automation, you review it, and you have more automation and deployment and so forth. But yeah, just a small section of this. So this slide is about cloud IDEs. I don't know if anyone, let me know in the chat if you've used a cloud IDE, something like Code Spaces or Gitpod. They're becoming more and more popular. They've been around for a long time, but now that you're able to have a whole dev environment behind it with containers and so forth, makes it really interesting. Imagine someone just being able to kind of click a button and have your entire dev environment set up, which is kind of the same version as prod. Is really, really impressive. And no matter what you're doing, if you're writing code, tests, docs, you usually do it within IDE so you can benefit from the plugins, linters, CoPilot, and I've got a video on CoPilot in a minute if anyone's not familiar with that. You know, we all have different computers, different operating systems, different specs, and we set up our IDEs differently. But what happens if we could make it the same? Well, you can with these tools, you can have that whole dev environment in the IDE set up as needed. I know people like to customize it and they can still customize it further, but at least there's a good base, a good starting point. I mean, one thing I really love about Gitpod is when a pull request comes in, and I really believe pull requests are more important than what I'm working on because it's closer to the definition of done. So it's further down the workflow. But if a pull request comes in, usually you have to stash your changes, bring down the pull request, test it locally and all the rest, as well as review it online. But what happens if you could just click a button in the pull request and it opens a whole dev environment in the browser? You can have a test. You could either, approve it, not approve it. And then when you close it, the whole environment disappears. Therefore, I don't have to change any of my working dev environments. It becomes really efficient to do that. And you can even take it further and deploy production-like environments with pull requests. Again, that's a discussion for another time, and it's something that we have done before. There's just so many benefits to this. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to briefly go over this, but if anyone else has any questions on this, we can dig deeper. But one-click setup, that's one thing I want people to take away with. Just get people running day one. I think it's really, really important. And if you've heard of dot files, you can customize this with dot files as well. So pair programming is really useful. It really improves the quality, but it does take up 2 people's times. I still think there is a massive benefit to this, but now with tools like GitHub CoPilot, and this video should hopefully start playing. Let me see. Yes, so the video is going to start playing, so you can see kind of what GitHub CoPilot looks like. What you see in the light gray that's going to appear about, I slowed the video down a bit so it wasn't too fast, but I'm regretting it now. So here you go, in light gray, you can see GitHub Copilot making suggestions. And if you wanted to accept them, you just hit tab. So you can see I write in a React project, or maybe it's Next.js, but it's still React. You can see it's auto-completing what I need, and I'm just hitting tab. So it already knows that I'm calling an endpoint and I probably would need these. And it's looking at the rest of my code as well as what people have done in the past and so forth. And it's really, really interesting. And then you can go back and customize it further if you need. So GitHub Copilot really allows us to get a lot faster, especially with prototyping. I mean, it's obviously not perfect, but it's really, really interesting. It is limited by the internet, so you do need a good internet connection for that. One of my favorite things. So in the chat, has anyone used GitHub Actions? Let's say yes or no in the chat. Let me know. GitHub Actions is CI/CD, a bit like Circle CI or Travis CI, but I really find I said GitHub is like social media, but on steroids, or GitHub Actions is like any standard CI, but on steroids, because you can trigger from any event. And as you can see on my screen, by any event, I mean raising an issue, editing an issue, all the way to adding code or adding code to a certain directory or certain file type. Like there's so many customizations you can do with just a few lines of config. So it doesn't need any massive coding. And I'm going to show you some examples in a moment. But you can see on my screen from a week ago, there are, actually this screenshot was a few months ago, they have over 11,000 actions that you can use for free. And literally copying and pasting their example and tweaking what you need. And like I said, I'll show you what this means. And if you don't find what you want, or the configuration for the existing actions isn't enough, you can create your own GitHub Actions. And this is really straightforward as well. You could use your favorite language that you want, JavaScript or Python, or anything like that. And you can version the actions and all the rest, everything you would do with a GitHub repo, which is great. So I actually want to look at, maybe some of you want to look at actually some code. So this is what GitHub Action looks like, right? This is really complicated. You're going to be here till tomorrow. Well, to be honest, the name is really straightforward. You can write what you want in there. It's what will appear on the right-hand side. as well. Then you have the jobs that you want to run. So you can see under jobs, you've got tests. And then on the right-hand side, you can see under jobs, it says tests. You talk about what environment you want it to run on, and then the steps that you want to take. Check out the code. We want Node version 4, and then we want to install the dependencies, and then we want to run the tests for the project. And it will run. It'll go green or red if it fails. But also you can click on it, and then you can see the logs of the actual output of that. We only have one step in this, one job in this. You can have multiple jobs, and I'll bring you an example of that in a second. This is one of my favorite GitHub Actions. I know you're all going to love it. So I actually want you to all to not fall asleep for a moment, and then give this action a rating out of 10 of how amazing you think it is. So 10 being amazing, 0 you think it's terrible. So who hates creating change logs? I know I do. It's just the most awful thing to do it manually. Well, you can actually automate this with a GitHub action. So as you can see on the left, start at the bottom on the left, we have version 0.4.4, and that's a bug fix. And then the one above that jumps to 0.4.5, because then again, it's a bug fix when you can see it's got a link in the release to the actual commit that changed. And then if you look at the one above, it bumps to 0.5.0. So the minor bumps because it's got a feature in there. And the changelog, they're quite small because we deploy multiple times a day, but you still get the idea. But you've got list the bug fixes, 1 in this case, at the top, and then it lists the features again, 1 in this case, at the top. Oops, there we go. That's all automated. So the changelog is automated, and the version number bumping is all automated using Semver, and it all happens automatedly. That's not even a word. So let's just skip that over and move on. But all my open source projects, the first thing I do is set this up. It takes seconds to set up, and it's mostly copy and paste YAML config, and it's really, really nice. And it actually on GitHub will create a release and create a GitHub tag as well. And there's just so many things you can do with this. And this is actually the what is used to create the release. So it's a bit more than the other one, but it's all copy and paste. Nothing's really going to change for you. It is exactly the same. You might use a different version, but it's pretty much the same. Your tokens might change as well, but that's about it. And here I'm triggering when changes go into the main branch, but you could trigger for something else. You could trigger for whatever you want. You could trigger for multiple things. You could be a manual click, because on GitHub Actions, you can have the option, there is no trigger. The trigger is you manually clicking do it now. So I think that's really important. I'm just checking time. Okay. This is what the multiple steps look like. So you can see you've got build, you've got create the container. This is not for the release. This is the step afterwards. You create the Docker container and pushes the image to the GitHub registry, and then also deploys to our Kubernetes cluster. And this is not much longer than the previous one that you saw. So you can see it's fully automated. If any step breaks, you can see where it broke. So GitHub Actions automate literally everything. Anything you do multiple times, automate it. It's really, really important. Do have a look at the marketplace. PRs are not just for reviewing someone else's code. It's also great for knowledge transfer, because then you get to see what other people have been working on and you're familiar with it. So really, really important. Okay. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go straight to the conclusion. Open source your projects early as possible. I mean, that's just so important. You have a different mindset for the entire team. You'll make sure you don't put anything private in it. You'll make sure you'll put in the extra 5% to make sure the quality is even better. And don't get left behind with the other organizations that are going open source as well. You'll see the quality skyrocket so much. When I had one client and I said to the team, I'm going to open source this project next week, all the team were like, oh, wait a second, can we just have some time? I need to improve some of the stuff I did last week. Everyone's really conscious of that, right? You're not going to put your bad photos on Instagram. You're going to put your good ones. So it's same with coding. So I think that's really, really important. The mindset definitely shifts and changes. It will reduce your onboarding process. It will make hiring a lot easier and retaining it as well. So now I'm super excited to get on to everyone's questions.
So we're going to take some time now to head over to the questions box. I know we had quite a few at the start and throughout, so I'll let you catch up on what's in there and take it from there.
Sounds good. So Interested in licensing risks and how to avoid them. So this is from Dan Smith. What questions to ask during the due diligence exercise? I think definitely get the legal team involved, because they're going to understand it a lot more. But I think it's quite niche and quite specialized, so you might have to get some external people in on this as well. GitHub has a website called choosealicense.com. GitHub maintains that, and they give you a brief overview of the licensing, and you can compare them, like not pros and cons, but like kind of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And that's really useful to see at a high level. But I think for the big corporates, they're going to make something a lot more formal, so there is a process of what is used. Licensing is a hard one. I think GitHub and other places are trying to make it easier. But it's something that's definitely a bit like documentation, definitely overlooked and forgotten. But Dan, let us know anything specifically you have concerns with, but I hope that helps. Gary says, are there any security flaws with open source? I think the opposite. I think open source has less security. Like I mentioned, people are more conscious about the work that they do. People are more likely to review it before it gets merged in. There are huge benefits. And also, say, for example, you haven't got time to update your dependencies, someone in the community could do it for you, because they see that as a fairly easy contribution, because maybe they've done it for their project, for their client, for their company's project, whatever it is. So, for example, on our API project for the EdiHub community project, I wanted to do an update of one of the dependencies, but I needed to reread the docs of the new changes. But someone said, I can do it a lot faster because I've done it on my project already. And yes, they did it considerably faster. So people want to get involved and want to make those improvements. So I think, I don't think there are any to worry about. I think the pros outweigh the cons. I think that's just definitely one thing to take away with. Open source versus coding in open. Are we describing truly open source with a community? Chris, yeah, I believe so. So I really think so. You're right, there is a difference, and a lot of people don't differentiate between the two. But I would say, yes, making it fully transparent, fully open source, having a roadmap. I mean, Gitpod that I mentioned, 100% open source. They even have office hours you can go join. There are just so many companies out there that are really transparent, and they hire. So I know Gitpod has made some hires from the EdiHub community directly because they've been contributing to their project, and they said, well, do you want to get paid to do this? And it's really, really interesting. So you don't even need that long, lengthy interview process that both parties probably don't want to do. Yes, and I have seen recruiters getting more kind of familiar with GitHub and seeing what companies have open source projects, because it gives them a way to contact people who are contributing to the company's open source projects and to find top talent as well. So yeah, I think we are talking truly about open source, definitely. Let me read this one. Osman, I hope I pronounced your name right. You'd like to know more if companies who are market competitors can participate in the open source communities. Not entirely sure what you mean by that, but I mean, I see so many competitors out there still use a lot of the open source technologies and still collaborate. I mean, I see Google and Microsoft developers collaborate on open source projects. I mean, TypeScript, for example, I think was started by Google, if I remember correctly, and then Microsoft started maintaining it more, and they all still contribute to it. So yeah, I think it's becoming more collaborative, and I think that's where those companies are really accelerating with everything across the board. Like I said, people, technical ability, the best practices, really, really important. What do you see the number one business issue companies trying to solve through the adoption of open source? So thanks for the question, Gary. So I think a lot of companies use open source, but they don't realize they do. The amount of clients that didn't know why they weren't paying for software. I said, well, it's open source, we're using JavaScript or Node or whatever it is. And they couldn't understand it. So, but who can we pay to say that we can use it? And then that's a hard hurdle for them to get over, but then they get over that quite quickly because it's not costing them money. But then to open source their projects, they get a lot more apprehensive about that. So I think there's two discussions there, because there's two sides. There's one consuming it, and there's one kind of open sourcing and being the maintainer itself, which is why I say to everyone, you'll learn different skills by contributing to open source. You'll learn so many great skills, but also by being a maintainer, you'll learn so many more, because you'll get people raising issues on your project that just says, improve X. And you're thinking, but how to improve it. Why haven't you written a description in the issue, which in turn makes your issues, when you raise them other projects, better because you get to see the flip side. So I think that's really important. So I think it's definitely going to be interesting in 2022. Gary, I don't know if I answered your question. If I didn't, please rephrase it and tack it onto the bottom and we'll get to it. Chris, where do you see the thresholds to transitioning from just coding in open to being open source and fostering a community of external contributors before engagement, Slack, etc.? So I see so many companies having Discord or Slack. I think a lot of them are moving over to Discord because it's got the more community focused. Slack's usually for kind of internal, from what I've seen. And yeah, fostering a community is hard. Like it's hard. In addition to the open source code, like you said, having the community there strengthens the collaboration and empowers the community members to help each other. So not just in a GitHub issue to help each other, but if they see a question in Discord and they know how to answer it, they will jump in and help. I think it's important to empower the community members. I see a lot of companies now really hiring a DevRel team, and not just DevRel as in just coders, but also coming from the other side, people who might be more in the event organization space, and they have DevRels from multiple points of view. The community managers, which I really think adds so much value as well. You don't want a team of like 5 DevRels all coming from a coding side. You need some coming from the other direction, so they can give different points of views and improve the whole community. Communities are definitely growing around projects, and that's what I think is going to be so exciting, super, super interesting. And companies that don't do that are going to get left behind, really, really are. So here's a private message I got. What advice do you have around managing senior stakeholders in an organization where they're not for open source? Just fire them all. It's fine, problem solved. So I think we need to educate them. And I think a lot of people who have been in the industry for a very, very long time, they want a kind of a simple life. And this is quite scary for them. I mean, go back 10 years and maybe, okay, let me take myself for example, right? So I'm in my 40s. Let me go back to kind of when I was 16, 17. If we had Uber back then, I said to my parents, I'm just going to get in the car of a stranger, they're going to say, no, you're not. Whereas now Uber is it's just something that everybody uses. So I think, times do change, but I also think people at the closest to the top, because they're not so hands-on, they want to reduce the risk, but by sometimes not doing some of these actually increases the risk. And again, we just need to educate them. And that's what a lot of my kind of workshops and things are around educating the senior stakeholders and taking them through the process so they can see the benefits and see there aren't really that many downsides. Amol asks, what are the steps we need to take prior to open source project? So just to clarify, is that to open sourcing your project? So I would say if you open source it from day one, you're going to make sure that it is got documentation, or at least basic documentation. You're not putting any tokens in there. You're really going to think of open source in mind. I would just automate as much as possible, and it is really straightforward to do it. When we create a new community project, kind of within 30 minutes, the whole automation and deployment to a whole Kubernetes cluster is all set up, including a dev environment in the cloud for people to just click and contribute with one click. So yeah, it is definitely possible, but I don't think people are aware of these tools. I'm only aware of them because I'm involved in the open source community, and I'm involved in other communities around, Eddie Hub and other company communities and so forth. So I think a lot of these people at the top don't get involved in that, so they don't see the benefits of all these new tools that are coming out. I say coming out, they might have been around for 6 years, but they were, very kind of beta in early days, and now it's more, much more feature rich and useful. Another DM. So are there any large enterprises that do open source really well? Yeah, to be honest, I was never a fan of Microsoft back in the day, but Microsoft have really flipped, like gone from being really proprietary, closed source to open source. And they're doing a really great job. They've open sourced all their documentation. They have people to help people get involved in their contributing to their projects. They run competitions, free swag giveaways, and people love that. So that's really, really impressive what they've done. I think they're the first, or they're definitely in the top 5 open source contributors in the world as an organization, which I think is impressive. And same with Netflix, right? People wouldn't believe, Netflix, all their kind of streaming protocols are all open source and so on. So yeah, And there's smaller companies as well. Like I said, Gitpod are doing really well. They're really bringing the community into their conversation, and I'm helping a lot of my clients do that as well. So it's super exciting. I've got a few clients coming up in the next few months where we're going to be taking their projects open source, or they're open source already, but then they want to bring the community in. So they want to start a Discord community. They want to have office hours so they can help people do live streams or calls, or they can help people contribute to their projects. It's going to get super, super interesting. So Mark says, we're all happy to consume open source. Very, very true. But often it's harder to persuade enterprise organizations to contribute back. Also very, very true. Some enterprise organization repos don't have much of their own code available. How can we improve enterprise level contribution? So I touched on this, I think it was in my second case study, where we had a bug in one of the open source tools we were using, or it wasn't a bug, I think. Well, there was a bug, but there was also one I'm thinking of is there was a slightly feature missing. It wasn't configurable. So we contributed that back. They were happy with that for us to schedule time into the sprint to do that because we needed it in our project. And then from that, it started snowballing. So I think, baby steps and do one step at a time. And then hopefully once enterprises start contributing back to the libraries they use, and it's not just code, right? Logging a bug, if you find a bug, log it with details. What version were you using, what environment were you in, what happened, and so forth. I believe is adding to open source. It's contributing to open source because it's adding value to the project and the community. Even verifying someone else's bug, I believe, is adding value, or verifying that it wasn't a bug for you in a different version or different environment. So that's a good way to start, and then you can kind of go further. Hopefully, in open sourcing some of the enterprise's projects. And again, like Netflix, for example, with their open source projects, you couldn't go start another Netflix. They keep the kind of the crown jewels private, but everything else, all the protocols, stream protocols, are all open source. So you have kind of 95% of what you need to start another Netflix, but is someone going to spend an effort on that 5% to do it? Probably not. So I think that's why some people do that model as well. So even if you write a library that you're using in various projects, open source that. Maybe other people can use that on their project. Again, it's kind of exposing the enterprise to open source, kind of one step at a time. Let's have a look. Osmar says, that did answer my question. Just to follow up, sure, this is great. I love questions, this is perfect. Does using open source affect innovation and outside the box thinking when solving problems? Yeah, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We definitely want to use the building blocks of open source projects and then focus on our business logic that adds value to our specific project. I mean, for example, when a builder wants to build a house, you could have sliding doors, you could have swinging doors, you could have, I don't know, I can't think of any other doors, but as an example. But they're not going to go and create all those doors, and they're not going to go create the bricks to build the house. They're going to kind of get the bricks that the person wants, the size, the color, the type for the environment. And I think that's what open source is. It's kind of, if we're consuming open source, we're using building blocks to build our project. So I think that allows us to focus on our project. And then we might create our own custom building blocks, which we should really then open source as well. It will improve the value of that quality, as I've said multiple times throughout, so I won't bore you all with that again. And hopefully, ideally, we can open source our main project. But I think open sourcing components or libraries that we use in our projects, I think is a great way to start. So thank you so much for that.
That was great. Thank you so much, Eddie. I appreciate your talk and for sharing your insights and for answering all those questions today. So thanks for everyone that obviously contributed to the questions, and we really hope that you've found this session useful. Before we go, I guess just from my side, really pleased to share actually that we've got a number of organisations that are embracing open source, and I know that we're currently building out our engineering and data teams. So if you're on the session and you're looking for that next opportunity, please get in touch, and I'll be sharing more details after the session. And then I know, Eddie, that obviously there'll be things that you've referenced today, and you mentioned a couple of videos. It'd be great, we can obviously share that with the community after, and I'm sure you'll share your details to reach out after today.
Sounds good. Yeah, I can drop my web link in the chat if people want to go straight away, but you're right, you'll have some resources. Oh, that was directly to you. That's not very good. I'm not familiar with Zoom. My apologies. But yes, And I'll share some resources for you as well to share everybody else. If anyone has any question, do reach out to me on Twitter, for example. I have one favor to ask everyone, and it's not to follow me. No, it is to not ask me in a DM, because other people that will learn from the discussion. So ask me any questions you want. I'm pretty much an open book, but ask it in public, and therefore other people can also get involved in the conversation. You can learn from other people's perspectives. They can jump into the conversation, and also other people can learn from the discussion. So please do reach out, but publicly, I would really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Eddie, and thanks all for joining today, and see you all at a tech series real soon. Take care all. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.